Named after a mischievous raven from a German poem, the Ta-183 Hückebein was almost as fictional, being a concept design that never got past the prototyping stages. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the PM model Ta-183 Hückebein in 1/72 scale. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit to take a look at the included paint schemes, plastic parts and decals, check out the dedicated unboxing video that I've already made on that topic. In this particular video I'm going to be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review at the end. I'll put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see in this video. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'm going to cut away the parts from the sprue using my cutters or a sharp knife. Any rough areas of plastic or excess flash can be carefully cleaned up using a sanding stick or carefully shaved away with a knife. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and the first steps were to assemble the very sparse cockpit details. On the cockpit floor, the rudder pedals and control column were added, which was then followed by the seat for the pilot. Unfortunately, no crew figures are included in this particular kit. This could then be glued inside of one of the fuselage halves, and that's pretty much it for the details inside of the aircraft. An engine exhaust component can be glued in at the back of the aircraft, and now it's time to do a little bit of painting. Humbrol number 240, which is an RLM02 colour, would be painted onto all of the interior cockpit areas. This was just done by hand using a paintbrush. I'm not using any thinner on this paint, so one coat would be sufficient. Humbrol number 62, which is a leather colour, would be used on the seat to give a representation of padding on the backrest. Humbrol 32, which is a dark grey, would be used to pick out the top of the control column and also the surround of the cockpit area. Because this aircraft features tricycle landing gear, I don't want it to sit on its tail. Liquid gravity would be glued inside of the nose of the aircraft. I'm using some matte Mod Podge here to hold it in place, and whilst this does have a longer drying time than other products such as superglue, it should not react with any of the clear parts which I'll add later and cause them to fog up. A good amount of this liquid gravity would be glued inside of the fuselage, as far forward as the main landing gear as possible, to give it enough nose weight so that it wouldn't sit on its tail later on. And with that done, I then glued together the two fuselage halves. The fit is okay, but the join is not amazing as there is a little bit of misalignment. There are some small gaps as well, so some Ammo MIG putty surfacer in medium consistency would be painted along these gaps to fill them in, and then the seams would be sanded smooth to try and give a better finish. The wings come as single pieces, which are glued into their slots at the wing roots. The tail comes as a single piece, which is glued on top of the aircraft's rudder. The air intake at the front of the aircraft can then be glued in, and I then also glued into place the landing gear covers on the nose wheel bay, but I will leave the main gear bay covers and landing gear legs and wheels all off for now and add them after painting. Humbrol Clear Fix would be used to glue into place the cockpit canopy. You get a single clear part, and as is quite standard, I have masked this myself using some masking tape and applied in the relevant areas, which would make it appear as though there are some cockpit canopy framework. As is quite standard with some PM models, the clear parts are little more than just moulded shapes, so the paint is pretty much going to be giving the impression of the framework. And now it's time to prime. I've been enjoying using this matte black primer from Army Painter recently, and this would be applied over the entire aircraft and also those elements which are yet to be added for the landing gear bays. This should give a good surface for the next layers of paint to stick to. And speaking of the next layers of paint, I'm going to go with this Vallejo light blue RLM 78. I find that adding a small drop of thinner can help prevent tip dry, but this is primarily a airbrush ready paint and can be applied straight from the bottle in the airbrush. This was sprayed onto the lower surfaces of the aircraft as well as the landing gear bay covers, which I've not yet added. I pretty much went for a fairly uniform finish and didn't see the need to try any pre-shading because there's not many panel lines to actually follow on this aircraft. I decided I would do the desert scheme that PM Model suggests in this particular kit, so for this sand yellow RLM 79 was the next paint to be loaded into the airbrush. I've had a bit of a German aircraft bug recently and I've been enjoying practicing my painting skills. I haven't masked anything up, I'm literally just practicing my airbrushing techniques to see if I can apply this paint neatly and get a nice neat edge between the colours. This yellow would form the base for the upper surfaces, and I would do a little mottling as well, just below where the upper camouflage meets the lower blue colour. For the second part of the camouflage scheme, I've gone with this brown violet RLM 81, and you can see that I've already masked off the splinter camouflage scheme. This was done using tape, trying to follow the suggested paint scheme as close as I could. Once again, I haven't done any masking between the upper and lower camouflage colours though, and I'm going to try and do my best to make it as neat as possible. Once again, I would attempt a little bit of mottling where the upper and lower surfaces meet. Whilst that's drying, the RLM 02, which I used earlier on, makes a reappearance here and would be used to paint the landing gear legs, the internal surfaces of the landing gear doors, and the hubs of the landing gear wheels. I would also carefully paint it on the internal surfaces of the landing gear bays on the aircraft, but I did this off camera. This gunmetal paint was painted onto the engine exhaust area, and I did this carefully, trying to get a nice neat edge. And with that done, it's now time to move on to the decals. So you get one small sheet of decals included, which can represent one of two different paint schemes suggested by PM models. The decals are to a moderate quality, but the registration is a little bit off, so some of the colours don't align as neatly as they should. I cut the decals that I wanted from the sheet and then soaked them in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you ever get your cup of tea confused with your brush water, why not get a brush water mug and never make that mistake again. Plus, it helps support the channel. There aren't that many decals to apply to this kit, so this step was actually quite quick. The decals were selected and slid into the relevant positions, and I found that these went on with no real problems. Perhaps it would have been easier to paint the white band on the rudder, but I decided I would see how the decal fared by making sure I used it in this build, and actually it seems to have done a reasonable job. I partly chose this paint scheme because I've never done a German aircraft in a desert scheme before, and I thought it would be interesting to see what it would look like. But also this particular paint scheme comes with some, I think they're piranha teeth, which goes on the nose, and I wanted to see how these decals would perform. And actually, they went on okay. To help soften the decals into the surface of the plastic, I've decided to use some Mr. Hobby Mr. Mark Softer, and this would be painted over the top of the decals, and this should help soften them in and make them appear as though they were painted on. I find this particular solution works quite well for PM models decals. When the decals had cured, this custom service satin varnish was loaded into the airbrush, and the entire aircraft was given a clear coat of this to help protect it in the next steps. I'm going to do a little weathering, and my favourite wash at the moment is this homemade Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel, which I thinned down with white spirit to make a very thin paint. This would be painted over the entire aircraft, and whilst this does have some recessed panel lines for this wash to soak into, there aren't that many. So all I'm trying to do here is give a little bit of dirt and grime, add a bit of contrast, and make the aircraft not look quite as clean as it was before. Any excess wash could be carefully removed with a cotton bud soaked in white spirit, or reactivated with the brush if I needed to move any of it around. But I would leave that to dry and then build up the landing gear. The wheels get glued onto the landing gear legs, and then the landing gear legs get glued into their slots in the side of the landing gear bays. I did have to make sure not to forget to add the landing gear wheel and leg for the nose, and then finally attach the landing gear covers for the main bays as well. It doesn't really tell you what angle these should be at, so I just made them look symmetrical. This K-Colors XW1, which is an ultra matte paint, was then airbrushed over the entire aircraft to dull down that satin finish which I applied earlier. This will just blend everything together and make it look a bit more uniform. My final step was to carefully peel off my homemade masks from the cockpit canopy, and they seem to have done a good job. With that, I'm going to call my build of the PM model Ta-183 Hückebein in 1/72 scale complete. And there we have it, that's another build under the belt. So I'll talk about some of the more negative aspects of this kit and then swing into the positive things that I really liked. So off of the bat, this is a little bit of an older tooling, so it does feature a relatively simple construction method. The details are quite lacking, there is a little bit of flash which needs to be removed in places, and the joins between the parts are not great. I did have to address some of them with a bit of sanding and filling, but there is a little bit of a gap here and there which is still visible. Also, the decal registration is not fantastic, so the different colours don't line up as well as they should, and I think it's particularly noticeable on the number 2 on the side of the aircraft and also on the crosses for the Luftwaffe insignia. Things don't quite line up as neatly as they should. And also, whilst the details are quite lacking, the lack of a pilot figure means that if you wanted to have this in a flying pose, you would probably have to source one from the spares box if you wanted to do that. I think it would be relatively easy to display this in a flying pose by modifying the landing gear bay covers and gluing them into the landing gear bays in the closed position. Swinging on to the more positive aspects though, despite the fact that this is a 1992 tooling, the version I have here is from 2020. It does feature recessed panel lines as mentioned earlier, which means they did catch a little bit of that wash that I applied, and the low part count of only 23 parts means you can make pretty quick progress with this one. I actually keep a note of everything that I do in my modelling journal, which is almost like a logbook which I keep on my workbench to keep track of everything that I'm doing, and you can find these in the links in the description if you'd like to get your own copies to keep a track of your own builds on your own workbenches. In here I made a note that this one took me about 3 days to complete, and some aspects of this build didn't take very long at all. Another positive aspect is that the price of this kit is relatively cheap. Retailing for a recommended retail price of £6.99 here in the UK, it is a little bit better value than some of the other PM model kits that I've reviewed recently. Especially given that you consider that it has 2 different paint schemes to choose from, the painting instructions are in full colour, and despite some of the problems that I encountered, it was generally quite a pleasant build. It's a slightly obscure looking aircraft, which supposedly may have helped inspire the MiG-15, and in the paint scheme that I've chosen here, it will definitely be a bit of a conversation piece when people spot it on my display shelf. I chose this kit to explore my painting skills, and actually I feel like I'm starting to make a bit of improvement. I feel like the modelling has come out much neater than it has on some of my previous builds, and I really like the splinter camouflage. I have got some more German subjects in my stash somewhere, and I'm looking forward to seeing if I can further improve in the future on some more builds. But I think it's probably time to wrap this one up here. This is a cheap model kit of an obscure subject, and although the kit does suffer from a few problems here and there, it is reasonably good value, fairly simple to construct, and I did enjoy having a go at this one. I often ask myself if I would consider buying a kit like this again, and actually, maybe in the future, I might try out the other paint scheme included. And with that, it's time to call this video here. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the club and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these guys on screen whose extra support allows me to create consistent content. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the club. They are Crafty Trooper, Your Normal Plane Lover, Trenner's LP, and Alonso Atto Neira. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to help support the channel in other ways, full information is below the video, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.